I've worked on nuclear energy policy now, off and on, for probably the past 6 to 8 years. I did some of that during the White House, but then I moved from the White House to a lobbying firm and set up a shop to help work on energy and environmental issues, but specifically focused on advancing civil nuclear power in the United States. From there, I moved to the Senate Environment Public Works Committee, where I helped run the environment and nuclear portfolio there, and then I've been doing energy and advocacy work ever since, and also working with a few think tanks, one of them being CSIS, in helping develop a nuclear energy program and helping raise the profile of what we consider to be an extremely important issue, one of the most important issues that people don't talk about in Washington, and that is the problems facing the U.S. civil nuclear sector. It's our opinion that the civil nuclear sector is in decline, and this will have serious implications for U.S. national interests as we move forward in the next few decades. Again, the sector's in trouble. 2010 was one of the first references that I found. There was a Department of Commerce International Trade Administration report that warned that the sector had atrophied. Again, this decline should be troublesome to any policymaker, whether it's American or one of our allies, in the sense that there are links between our civil nuclear program and our national security interests, including sort of the U.S. ability to help shape the nonproliferation agenda from a global perspective. But it also has links to sort of U.S. environmental and climate mitigation goals as well, because we cannot meet any type of climate mitigation goal without having, in our opinion, a substantial build-out of nuclear, much less, what do you do if there's a serious contraction in our nuclear fleet? So when I look at the state of the civil nuclear sector, I think that in Washington you still have a number of people who are focused on, well, how do we actually build out the civil nuclear sector? Do we need a carbon tax? What kind of carbon regulation do we need, etc. But when you get into the weeds and you start talking to industry, industry's really focused on two issues. From an operator perspective, it's a focus on threat to existing units. So it's very hard for a nuclear operator, for example, to talk about investing in a new nuclear plant when they're concerned about can they keep their existing fleet open. I think that if we don't have a substantial shift in policy, you're going to have a number of reactors closed prematurely in the United States between now and I would say between now and 2020. Maybe half a dozen reactors, possibly more. There's been a lot said about the impact of cheap shell gas. That certainly had a major effect on the economics of nuclear. But when you get into really what's going on, it's really the poorly structured, deregulated markets and the market distortions that are impacting the competitiveness of the nuclear fleet. That's really where the biggest problem is. And especially since these externalities and distortions are unlikely to change or be corrected in the near term. The fleet's contracting. You probably saw the announcement that we've got 5 new reactors being built in regulated markets in the American South. But the real state of the sector was reflected in last year's announced shutdown of 5 reactors. Okay, 2 of those small reactors, Kewaunee and Vermont Yankee, were prematurely shut down in large part because of subsidized renewables and poor market structure, and that's a sign of things to come. So when we look at this, we estimate that the fleet could contract from roughly 100 gigawatts at the beginning of last year to 80 gigawatts by 2030. And if we, and in our opinion, that's actually a fairly conservative scenario. It could be much worse than that. It's in stark contrast to a lot of the optimistic forecasts that you see We were talking about this earlier with the Energy Information Administration, which is really the U.S. government's sort of premier handler and forecaster with energy data, including sort of energy consumption trends, markets, etc. When they look at this, they actually don't see a contraction; they see an expansion of the fleet. But when they're modeling and looking at the assumptions, they don't look at what's actually going on in the market, which is a serious flaw in what they do. The merchant markets are broken. Half of our nuclear fleet's located in these competitive, deregulated markets for electricity. For those of you who may get lost in some of the economic jargon, in the merchant and deregulated markets, generators respond to market demand and sell their electricity at the going market price, whereas the generators in the regulated markets receive a price that's determined by the state regulatory authorities and allows them to recover the cost of their investment plus an authorized return. Again, about half of our fleet's located in the deregulated markets, and all the expansion that you've seen in Georgia, South Carolina, that's happening in the regulated markets. Okay, so it's important to make that distinction. Again, the biggest concern is subsidies, mandates for non-nuclear generation. It's really having a negative impact on the profitability of those nuclear reactors. We have a number of single units in merchant markets, about 7,500 megawatts that we see is being shut down. So those will be the first casualties in this. And going back to the two reactors that were announced last year, Kewaunee and Vermont Yankee, they're all single unit plants. But even some larger dual units are being threatened too, particularly those that are located where there's a large amount of subsidized wind power that has no place to go on the grid. Again, we talked a little bit about the impact on environmental goals. 2012, U.S. nuclear plants avoided 570 million metric tons of CO2. That's a lot of CO2. That if a lot of those plants go, what do you replace it with? And then on the polar vortex, here's an issue that really received a lot of visibility earlier this year. I'm not sure how much you follow this, but we came dangerously close to having a grid failure during some of the worst parts of the winter. And at least during the polar vortex, the nuclear fleet operated at 95% and actually became the primary provider of electricity in New England, okay, edging out gas. Now, what would have happened without those nuclear reactors? Boom, right? Vendors. Now, this is the other big piece. So if you're not building new nuclear, how do you preserve that domestic capacity? And so the issue here is that, at least from vendors, whether it's GE, Westinghouse, they're not going to be able to maintain that domestic manufacturing capacity without having increased access to foreign markets. You've seen reports that are fairly optimistic, showing that the global market for nuclear goods and services, I'm sure you've seen this, and I'm sure there could be numbers that are higher than that. Certainly, probably some that are lower. And at first glance, you would think that the U.S. could benefit substantially from it. A lot of our vendors put a lot of stake in the reputation of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, its standard of excellence. We basically say that it has the gold standard stamp of approval that everyone seeks. And given what nuclear is and the safety concerns of nuclear, you would think that in and of itself would give us a competitive advantage. And it does to an extent, but not enough. This report is a little dated, but it's by far the best report that I've seen over the past few years. It's a GAO report that was requested by Congress back in 2010. It looked at sort of the state of play with nuclear trade and where U.S. vendors are. In the vast majority of these categories that they looked at, even though in many cases you actually had an increase in the value of exports, you had a drop in the U.S. share, the market share, and including the construction builds. It's dated, but I think that if you look at the anecdotal evidence out there, it's obvious that the trend is continuing. You all know this, that U.S. firms face intense competition from state-owned, state-aligned enterprises that have government, political, and financial support. Some of these competitors are located in the largest markets for nuclear goods and services. And then we have this burdensome export regulatory regime and non-proliferation policy that fail to take into full consideration the current dynamics, whether they're the political realities or what's actually happening in the global market. In fact, you will in my opinion, you have a lot of people, particularly in Congress, who think that we're still living in 1975 or 1980, right? And of course, some of these guys have been around that long. An important issue that few people talk about in Washington in regard to the nuclear agenda is that the U.S. is struggling with its own fuel cycle issues. We no longer enrich uranium with our own technology. We stopped that as of May of last year. Right now, it doesn't look like we have a rosy future for our commercial program for enrichment. I think that there's a good chance that will likely face major obstacles and stall. It's come under intense criticism from the left and the right. From the right, because you have a lot of fiscal conservatives who see nuclear fuel as not a strategic asset, but they see nuclear fuel as just any other energy feedstock, whether it's coal or natural gas. So they balk at providing any real government support to building a commercial program. And then you have the left and the anti-nuclear group and the people who are focused on sort of ending the U.S. enrichment program because of its link to defense issues. Many of you are familiar with the fact that we don't have a federal resolution of the waste problem. This is a big challenge for us because we have 9 U.S. states that require a solution before any new nuclear can actually be built. Big states like California, New Jersey, Illinois. Okay, and so with the advance of EPA climate regulation and the impact of that regulation on our power generation, the big question is, well, what will replace coal plants and eventually natural gas in those plants without some type of federal solution? Having said all that, I think that we do have a good long-term outlook for a true nuclear renaissance, but that is determined almost entirely by the EPA climate regulatory agenda. But not just the climate regulatory agenda, but just the regulatory agenda on air quality in general, and then hydraulic fracturing. How will the federal government regulate hydraulic fracturing? What will be those impacts on the price of natural gas? This is going to take a long time. You're looking at 20 years plus for all this to sort of play out. So in the meantime, and I kind of call this the valley of death, you have a situation where if that holds true and if that scenario is likely, then how do we maintain our domestic capacity between now and then? Which takes us back to the importance of exports and a rational nuclear trade policy. Searching for solutions. We don't have to get too much into this, but a lot of people talk about subsidies and mandates for nuclear. I don't think that's going to happen for a variety of reasons. But even with subsidies, you're not going to have new nuclear being built in the near term because of all the problems in the deregulated markets that we talked about earlier. EPA regulation in and of itself won't fix those problems, so you can't get to it by that. You're not going to be able to redefine renewable energy mandates or clean energy mandates to include nuclear because the renewable energy sector needs those mandates and needs those subsidies to maintain their artificial market. And again, I don't think that we're going to have a situation where we have carbon trading and taxes that will get us to that type of support that changes the economics for nuclear in the near term. Pursuing a rational approach, I look at this really are two principles. You need to focus on the existing fleet and U.S. vendors. You need to try to fix the market distortions and the issue that baseload, including nuclear, is not being adequately compensated in those markets. Okay. And then the second piece being U.S. vendors. We need to pursue a rational approach to nuclear trade policy. If I'm going too fast, let me know. These specific recommendations, you can dig into these in the, we just published a paper, R Street, May 15th, really gets into the details on, what we can pursue, at least in the near term, to help the nuclear sector. The issues of more interest to you probably down at the bottom that impact the vendors. So the first four focus on the operators, 5 and 6, U.S. vendors. So challenges for South Korea. I think that one of your biggest challenges, and by the way, we actually share this challenge, right? Because it's part of my crusade to try to educate members of Congress and their staff and policymakers that there is this huge link between the civil nuclear sector and our defense needs, and that we're in decline, and that will have an impact on U.S. national security interests. So they don't appreciate the link. They don't appreciate the current dynamic in the global marketplace. A number of them fail to recognize that, and you would think that this would be a very obvious conclusion, but they fail to recognize that if we're not producing and selling nuclear goods and providing services, that we're not going to have that much of a voice in defining the trade of those goods and services in the global marketplace. I always point to the UAE contract as being the best example of the changing dynamic in the global marketplace. But the bottom line is that a lot of policymakers are missing the big strategic picture. This makes your mission more complicated because when you're talking about the South Korean nuclear program, it often gets mired in sort of the proliferation agenda, right? Rather than being part of a bigger picture where U.S. policymakers are looking at sort of the economic and energy security issues. Now the opportunities. I think it's incredibly important that that Korea not only embrace your leadership role in the global expansion, but also be very active in advocating the highest standards in safety, operation, and non-proliferation. I think that you certainly have those goals and objectives in your program, but I think at least in Washington, they need to have a better understanding of what those are. And I think that in selling those things, I think it's important to propose bilateral, multilateral initiatives, not only with the United States, but with other major suppliers. And in my opinion, and I'm a critic of U.S. diplomacy, but not just in regards to Korea, but with a number of our other partners and allies, is that I think it's key. There's been, over the past number of decades, there's been a large deference to the United States and U.S. leadership. But I think it's time for our partners to demand more of the United States in accepting a true partnership. But to do that, I think that Korea needs to have a very active presence in helping define the global agenda on these issues. A very important thing is framing South Korea's program and what South Korea wants in terms of U.S. national interest. I think that, going back to the challenges, we could definitely use your help to educate Washington in making the link between commercial and national security issues. Again, we need to understand the big picture. I'm a huge proponent of broadening out your engagement I think you should diversify away from the State Department when you can. I think that you should engage the people who work on energy and economics more often, because they will be much more sensitive to what you're actually trying to do. I mean, there are energy security benefits to South Korea. There are energy security benefits to South Korea, and there are energy security benefits to the United States for this, right? Given your current dependence on coal and natural gas imports, you have security issues regarding shipping lanes. If you become a fuel supplier, that helps diversify the market. You know, going back to the United States again, we're not, at least from the U.S. perspective, we're not going to be involved in the commercial nuclear fuel game. At least it doesn't look that way anytime soon. We run the risk of running into a situation where the Russians may gain a monopoly over nuclear fuel. So I think fuel diversity is incredibly important. Again, looking at the long run, especially if the United States has to build out its nuclear fleet, I think that you should consider new or strengthen existing partnerships with the U.S. government and the private sector on SMRs, advanced designs, and other technology issues. We've had a recent setback with our SMR program, where Babcock and Wilcox has decided to cut back the amount of money that's investing in the SMR program. So I think that's definitely concerning a lot of people in Washington, including the Department of Energy and SMR proponents in Capitol Hill. And by the way, we need SMRs. SMRs are incredibly important to the future of the U.S. generation mix, simply because, and this becomes somewhat of a political issue, but you have a situation where you have a lot of municipals and cooperatives in the electricity markets that have one coal plant, right? They're going to lose that coal plant. And what are they going to replace that coal plant with, right? So in a number of cases, you're going to have, and they're not going to want to be dependent on natural gas. And again, the future of regulation on natural gas is definitely up in the air. So SMRs, small modular reactors, can provide, I think, a lot of insurance there for those players. But then also, even for the bigger utilities that are going to have to shut down coal plants, they're not going to want to replace the coal plant with a big reactor. So there are a lot of load growth and load considerations as well that definitely make an argument that we need SMRs, especially when you get into the next decade when all this EPA regulation is having an effect on the market. And we are currently planning a Capitol Hill Forum on international cooperation in nuclear technology. And by the way, this is part of our strategy to diversify away from some of the foreign policy types. This would be with the House Science Committee, okay, in cooperation with the Energy and Natural Resources Committee in the Senate to bring together a number of foreign governments and members of Congress to talk about the benefits of international cooperation in nuclear technology, and plus, you know, be able to have an exchange on best practices, et cetera. And so, especially on the research and development programs, because we're really, at least in the United States, we're struggling with how to move forward with that, given our budget constraints.